Hey, hold up.
Yeah?
Where are you heading?
Platform 5.
Don't reach. Keep your hands visible.
Okay. Am I being stopped for a reason?
I'm not doing anything.
Hey, just stay right there.
I'm not resisting. Stop moving.
I've got his arm.
I'm not resisting.
At 6:58 a.m. on a Monday morning, inside Union Bay Transit Hub in Port Calder, Louisiana, a routine commuter rush was interrupted by an incident that would later draw federal attention. The terminal was already busy. Morning trains were cycling through platforms. Commuters moved with practiced urgency, coffee cups in hand, earbuds in, eyes flicking between phones and departure boards. The air smelled faintly of diesel and burnt espresso. Near Platform 5, 2 officers from the Port Calder Transit Police stepped into the path of a man walking alone. Less than 30 seconds later, he was on the ground. The sound was dull but unmistakable body against concrete. A black document folder slipped from his hand and skidded across the floor, papers spilling loose. Conversations nearby stopped mid-sentence.
Hey, hold up.
Yeah?
Where are you heading?
Platform 5.
Don't reach. Keep your hands visible.
Okay. Am I being stopped for a reason?
Someone gasped. A man near the ticket kiosks instinctively raised his phone, unsure whether he was witnessing a lawful detention or something else entirely. The man on the ground was Malcolm Reed, age 39.
Not resisting. Stop moving. I'm lying still.
He was face down, cheek pressed to the terminal floor. One officer had a knee planted between his shoulder blades. The other was pulling his arms behind him, forcing his wrists together. Reed did not strike back, he did not shout. His breathing was audible, controlled, deliberate. "I'm not resisting," he said, calm, measured, repeated. Reed was wearing plain civilian clothing. Dark slacks, a gray button-down shirt, a worn leather messenger bag slung across his shoulder before it had been yanked free. Nothing about him stood out to nearby passengers, except what happened next. One of the officers tightened his grip and barked, "Stop tensing up." Reed replied without raising his voice, "I'm lying still." The officers involved were later identified as Officer Paul Henson, 44, a 12-year veteran of transit police, and Officer Lucas Grant, 29, in his 3rd year on the force. Both were assigned to morning terminal patrol. Both were wearing body cameras, activated at the start of their shift. Terminal security cameras were also recording from multiple angles.
Hey, hold up.
Yeah?
Where are you heading?
Platform 5.
Don't reach. Keep your hands visible.
Okay. Am I being stopped for a reason?
According to witnesses, the encounter began when Henson noticed Reed walking briskly toward the outbound platforms, checking his watch as he moved. Henson stepped sideways, blocking Reed's path. "Hey, you hold up," Henson said. Reed stopped immediately. Henson asked where he was going, asked why he was in a restricted transit corridor, asked what was in his bag. The questions came quickly, one after another. The tone was sharp. Grant positioned himself slightly behind Reed, limiting his ability to move forward or step aside. Reed answered calmly. He explained he was traveling for work. He said he had documentation. When he began to reach toward the folder in his hand, Henson raised his voice. "Hands where I can see them." Reed complied instantly. He asked one question, "Am I being detained?" That was the moment the encounter shifted. Henson told him to turn around. Reed paused long enough to ask why. He did not raise his voice. He did not step away. He asked for clarification. Henson grabbed his arm. What followed happened in full view of
I'm not doing anything.
Hey, just stay right there.
I'm not resisting. Stop moving.
I've got his arm.
I'm not resisting.
dozens of commuters. A forceful pull, Reed stumbled, Grant moved in, Reed lost his balance. Then the takedown. When Reed hit the floor, several people shouted. A woman dragging a rolling suitcase stopped dead in her tracks. An older man wearing a construction vest took a step forward, then stopped himself, phone already recording. Henson ordered Reed to stop moving. Reed responded that he was not moving. Henson said Reed was actively resisting. Grant radioed dispatch requesting assistance to Platform 5. The entire sequence from first contact to Reed on the ground lasted less than 90 seconds. By 7:04 a.m., Reed was handcuffed. His wrists were pulled tight behind his back. His face showed no anger, only concentration, as if he were carefully choosing every breath. By 7:07 a.m., transit supervisors were being notified. By 7:11 a.m., internal messages flagged a use-of-force incident involving an uncooperative subject. No one on the platform yet knew who Malcolm Reed was. What they did know was what they could see. A black man restrained on the floor of a public transit hub, calmly stating compliance while officers insisted otherwise. As Reed was lifted to his feet, his shirt had ridden up slightly, revealing a lanyard tucked beneath it. A laminated card slipped free and dangled briefly before an officer pushed it back out of sight. No one examined it at the time. At 7:16 a.m., Reed was escorted away from the platform toward a service corridor, away from public view. At 7:19 a.m., a supervisor asked Henson what had prompted the stop. Henson's answer was short. Something didn't feel right. That explanation would soon be written into an official report. But elsewhere, on body cameras, on security footage, and on half a dozen civilian phones, the incident had already been captured in full. And within minutes, someone watching one of those recordings would notice a detail no one on the platform had bothered to verify. A detail that would raise a question far more dangerous than any posed that morning. Why was Malcolm Reed really taken to the ground? By 7:28 a.m., the first written account of the incident was already being drafted. Inside a small operations office adjacent to the terminal floor, Officer Paul Henson sat at a metal desk, body camera removed and placed in an evidence sleeve beside him. His posture was rigid. His jaw was set. He typed deliberately. The report identified the subject as an adult male later identified as Malcolm Reed. According to Henson's narrative, Reed had been observed moving quickly through a controlled transit area, displaying what Henson described as nervous behavior inconsistent with normal commuter patterns. The report claimed Reed avoided eye contact, hesitated when questioned, and made a sudden movement toward an unknown object, prompting officer intervention. The language was precise, procedural, familiar. Henson wrote that Reed became verbally defiant when asked to explain his presence and that he failed to comply with repeated lawful commands, necessitating a controlled takedown to prevent escalation and ensure officer safety. There was no mention of Reed stating compliance. There was no mention of Reed asking whether he was being detained. There was no mention of the document folder spilling across the floor. At 7:34 a.m., Officer Lucas Grant submitted his supplemental report. It mirrored Henson's in tone and structure. Grant stated that he observed Reed tense his body and pull his arm away as Henson attempted to gain control. The phrase active resistance appeared twice. Neither report cited a specific crime. Neither report referenced a warrant. Neither report identified any contraband or immediate threat. By 7:41 a.m., both reports had been entered into the Port Calder Transit Police System and flagged for supervisory review. On paper, the incident appeared justified. On the other side of the terminal, reality looked different. Malcolm Reed sat alone in a narrow holding room normally used for fare evasion processing. His hands were cuffed in front of him now, metal biting into his wrists. A transit medic had already stopped by, quickly documenting mild abrasions to Reed's cheek and forearms, as well as stiffness in his right shoulder. Reed declined hospital transport. He asked that the injuries be noted. A uniformed supervisor, Sergeant Denise Caldwell, entered the room at 7:46 a.m. She carried a tablet and a printed copy of the preliminary incident notification. She had not yet watched any video. She introduced herself, asked Reed if he needed medical attention again, asked if he understood why he had been detained. "I haven't been told a reason," Reed replied. Caldwell asked him to explain in his own words what had happened. Reed did not rush. He spoke evenly. He said he was traveling to an off-site work meeting. He said he had credentials and documentation in his folder. He said he complied with every command. He said the moment he asked why he was being stopped, hands were placed on him. He did not accuse, he did not speculate, he stuck to sequence. Caldwell made notes. She then asked a question that did not appear in any report. "Did you identify yourself?" Reed nodded once. "I told them I had identification and documentation. I was told not to reach for it." Caldwell asked where that identification was now. Reed glanced toward the corner of the room, where his messenger bag and folder sat on a bench, untouched since his detention. Caldwell retrieved the folder and opened it. Inside were several documents neatly arranged. At the top was a laminated access credential bearing Reed's name, photograph, and an embedded security seal. Below it were travel papers stamped and dated, along with a letter on official letterhead authorizing Reed's transit through multiple facilities that day. Caldwell paused. She checked the photograph. Then she checked Reed's face again. The match was exact. She did not comment immediately. Instead, she stepped out of the room. At 7:53 a.m., Caldwell met with Henson and Grant in the operations office. She asked them to walk her through the stop verbally. Henson did most of the talking. He emphasized Reed's body language, his tone, the fact that Reed had questioned the stop instead of immediately complying. Grant stood slightly behind Henson, nodding occasionally. He added that the situation felt like it could go bad fast. Caldwell listened without interruption. Then she asked, "Did either of you verify his credentials before going hands-on?" Henson answered quickly. "There wasn't time." Caldwell looked down at her tablet. The body camera metadata told a different story. From the moment Henson first addressed Reed to the moment he grabbed Reed's arm, 11 seconds had passed. Caldwell did not argue. She asked for the body camera footage. Henson hesitated, not long, but long enough. By 8:01 a.m., Caldwell was reviewing the footage in real time. She watched Henson step into Reed's path. She heard Reed answer questions calmly. She heard Reed ask whether he was being detained. She heard Henson's tone change. She watched the takedown. She watched Reed hit the floor. She heard Reed say clearly and repeatedly, "I'm not resisting." When the clip ended, Caldwell replayed it once more. Then she set the tablet down. At 8:08 a.m., she requested that Lieutenant Aaron Pike, the on-duty transit operations commander, respond to the terminal. That request was logged. Across the terminal, 2 commuters had already submitted formal complaints at the information desk. One attached video footage with the subject line, "Man slammed to ground at platform 5, officers say he resisted." At 8:16 a.m., Lieutenant Pike arrived. He watched the footage without speaking. He did not look at Henson while it played. When it ended, Pike asked a single question. "What was the suspected offense?" Henson answered, "Suspicious behavior." Pike waited. "Suspicious how?" Henson searched for words. "It just didn't add up." Pike nodded once. Then he said, "Relieve them." Henson stiffened. "Lieutenant, off the floor," Pike said, "both of you." By 8:22 a.m., Henson and Grant had been removed from active duty pending review. Their radios were logged. Their body cameras were secured. They were instructed not to discuss the incident with anyone except internal affairs. Malcolm Reed's cuffs were removed. He was offered water, a chair, privacy. Pike asked Reed if he wanted to make a call. Reed nodded, "I do." At 8:31 a.m., Reed placed a call from a secure office phone. The person who answered did not stay on the line long, but when Reed ended the call, Pike noticed something change. Reed did not look relieved. He looked resolved. Pike didn't yet know why, but within minutes the internal classification of the incident was quietly updated. No longer use of force resolved. It now read, "Use of force external review pending." And once that designation appeared in the system, there would be no way to contain what came next. At 8:47 a.m., the first message arrived through a channel Port Calder Transit Police almost never used. It wasn't sent through public affairs. It didn't come from city administration. It wasn't routed through the mayor's office. It appeared in the system as a federal preservation notice. The message was brief, formal, and unmistakable. Preserve all body camera footage, fixed surveillance video, radio transmissions, and written documentation related to the detention of Malcolm Reed. No modification, no deletion. Lieutenant Aaron Pike read it twice. He did not ask who sent it. He already knew. Inside a quiet administrative office overlooking the rail yard, Malcolm Reed sat alone. His jacket was folded on the table. The redness along his cheek had darkened into a visible bruise. When Sergeant Denise Caldwell entered, Reed looked up. "They've been notified?" he asked. Caldwell nodded. "Yes." Reed did not ask who they were. By 9:02 a.m., Transit Police IT personnel were pulling redundant copies of every relevant recording. Henson's body camera, Grant's body camera, fixed cameras from platforms 4 and 5, hallway cameras. Audio from dispatch. Everything was cloned, hashed, and sealed. At 9:11 a.m., an internal affairs investigator formally opened a use of force case. At 9:14 a.m., that case was expanded to include potential bias indicators. That classification was rare. It required justification. The justification was already on video. When investigators synchronized the footage, a pattern emerged immediately. Henson's tone changed before Reed questioned the stop. Henson positioned his body to block Reed's movement before any refusal occurred. Grant stepped in not as backup, but as containment. This was not reaction, it was anticipation. At 9:26 a.m., Officer Lucas Grant was interviewed separately. He sat across from an investigator, hands folded tightly, eyes fixed on the tabletop. "Did you believe Mr. Reed posed a threat?" the investigator asked. Grant hesitated. "No," he said finally. "Then why did you assist in the takedown?" Grant swallowed. "I didn't think it was my place to counter my partner." That answer was recorded verbatim. Across the building, Officer Paul Henson was growing agitated. He paced. He complained that the situation was being blown out of proportion. He repeated the same sentence more than once. "I followed training." When investigators asked him to identify the specific threat that justified force, his answers became abstract. He was evasive. He challenged authority. He didn't act like a normal commuter. When pressed to define normal, Henson had nothing concrete to offer. At 9:41 a.m., a second call came in. This one was not routed through Transit Police Command. It came through the city's legal office. A federal agency had requested immediate access to the preserved files, not copies. Originals, that request changed everything. At 9:55 a.m., Transit Police leadership was notified that the matter now involved federal jurisdictional interest. No public announcement, no internal memo. Just a quiet acknowledgement that local control had ended. Meanwhile, Reed was escorted to another office to provide a formal statement. He spoke calmly. He described the sequence without emotion. He explained why he did not resist. "I know how movement gets reinterpreted," he said. "I wanted the record clean." That sentence was flagged. At 10:18 a.m., the first civilian video surfaced outside the department. A 14-second clip showing Reed being driven to the floor while saying, "I'm not resisting." It was grainy, shaky, unedited, it spread anyway. By 10:34 a.m., Lieutenant Pike was reviewing Officer Henson's personnel file. Individually, the entries seemed inconclusive. Unfounded complaints, verbal counseling, notes about communication style. Taken together, they formed something else. A pattern. At 10:51 a.m., Pike made a decision. Henson and Grant were placed on administrative leave effective immediately. Their credentials were suspended. Their access was revoked. Henson reacted sharply. "This is politics," he said. Pike corrected him. "No. This is evidence." By 11:07 a.m., a preliminary summary was sent to the city's legal department. By 11:19 a.m., a federal civil rights review was quietly attached to the case file. Reed was informed. He nodded once. "I want everything preserved," he said. No one in the room misunderstood what that meant. Once federal oversight entered the process, outcomes stopped being negotiable. They became inevitable. And the next phase would not be about what happened on the terminal floor. It would be about who allowed it to happen. By early afternoon, the atmosphere inside Port Calder Transit Police Headquarters had shifted. What had begun as a procedural review was now defensive. At 1:12 p.m., a closed-door briefing was convened on the second floor of the administration building. Present were Lieutenant Aaron Pike, 2 internal affairs investigators, a representative from the city attorney's office, and a federal liaison officer whose title was not introduced, and did not need to be. The message was delivered plainly. This incident was no longer being evaluated solely under departmental use of force policy. It was now under review for potential violations of federal civil rights statutes, including unlawful detention, excessive force, and racial profiling. The body camera footage was central. Investigators broke it down frame by frame. No clearly articulated offense, no immediate safety threat, no refusal to comply. What they did see was escalation driven by perception rather than behavior. At 1:36 p.m., Internal Affairs issued a preliminary finding. Officer Paul Henson was cited for multiple probable policy violations. Failure to de-escalate, improper use of force, conduct unbecoming an officer. Officer Lucas Grant was cited for failure to intervene. Those findings triggered automatic notification to the State Law Enforcement Certification Board. Inside a separate room, Henson was informed of the decision. "They're sacrificing me," he said, "because it looks bad." The investigator responded evenly. "It looks bad because it is bad." Grant, when notified, said nothing at first. Then he asked a single question. "Does this end my career?" No one answered directly. At 2:04 p.m., Malcolm Reed participated in a secure interview with a federal investigator. The questions were methodical. "Did you resist?" "No." "Did you refuse lawful orders?" "No." "Did either officer use language you perceived as biased?" "Yes." That response was documented. At 2:19 p.m., federal authorities formally requested custody of the original video files. Transit Police complied. At 2:41 p.m., the city was notified that a Department of Justice preliminary civil rights review had been opened. Any possibility of quiet internal discipline was now gone. Statements would be sworn, records subpoenaed, histories re-examined. At 3:08 p.m., senior city officials were briefed. Public Affairs was instructed to prepare a holding statement in anticipation of media inquiries. Lieutenant Pike returned to his office and reviewed Henson's file again. This time, the pattern was unmistakable. The same vague language. The same justifications. The same benefit of the doubt. Pike understood something now. This was not a single bad decision. It was an accumulated failure. At 3:49 p.m., Pike signed the order placing Paul Henson on unpaid suspension pending termination review. Lucas Grant was suspended with pay pending certification board action. Both officers were escorted from the building separately. As Henson walked out, he muttered, "This never should have gone this far." Grant did not respond. At 4:22 p.m., the first media inquiry arrived. A reporter had obtained a short clip of the takedown. No names, no context, just a black man on the floor of a transit terminal saying, "I'm not resisting." The clip was already circulating. By 5 p.m., federal investigators were en route. And by the end of the day, what began as a routine stop inside a commuter terminal had become a test of accountability, one that would no longer be controlled locally. The escalation was complete, the collision was coming. The decisive shift came the next morning. At 7:54 a.m., two unmarked vehicles pulled into the secured lot behind Port Calder Transit Police Headquarters. There were no lights, no announcements. The people who stepped out carried folders, not weapons. Federal investigators had arrived. Their first move was not interviews, it was data. By 8:07 a.m., they had requested every body camera recording involving Officer Paul Henson for the past 7 years. Every stop report, every internal complaint, every supervisory note referencing attitude, noncompliance, or officer safety concerns. The volume was larger than expected. When the records were arranged chronologically, a pattern emerged with disturbing clarity. Henson's use of force incidents disproportionately involved black commuters. His reports relied heavily on subjective language, evasive, argumentative, did not seem right. Specific offenses were often absent. Escalation occurred quickly. De-escalation attempts were rarely documented. Several complaints had been flagged internally. None had resulted in sustained discipline. One internal email from 4 years earlier stood out. A shift supervisor had written, "Henson escalates early and interprets questions as challenges. Recommend monitoring before this becomes a liability." No follow-up action was recorded. At 9:02 a.m., investigators interviewed Officer Lucas Grant again. This time the tone was different. "Did you believe Mr. Reed was reaching for a weapon?" "No." "Did you believe he was attempting to flee?" "No." "Then why did you assist in taking him to the ground?" Grant exhaled slowly. "I didn't want to undermine my partner in public." That answer was typed exactly as spoken. Across the hallway, Henson's interview was deteriorating. When investigators replayed the body camera footage frame by frame, Henson attempted to narrate over it, explaining what he felt rather than what was visible. When asked to identify the precise moment Reed became a threat, Henson pointed to the instant Reed asked, "Am I being detained?" "That's when it shifted," Henson said. One investigator leaned forward. "So the threat was a question." Henson did not respond. At 9:46 a.m., investigators introduced civilian footage taken from behind a structural column. The angle clearly showed Henson initiating physical contact before Reed's balance broke. The video contradicted Henson's report directly. Henson watched it in silence. Then he said quietly he didn't belong there. That statement ended the interview. At 10:21 a.m., Malcolm Reed provided a final sworn statement. He spoke without emotion. He explained why he remained calm while being restrained. "I know how fast narratives form," he said. "I wanted the evidence to speak, not me." That statement was forwarded to federal prosecutors. At 11:03 a.m., the Department of Justice notified city officials of its intent to pursue civil rights violations related to unlawful detention and excessive force. At 11:27 a.m., the State Law Enforcement Certification Board issued emergency notices initiating decertification proceedings against both officers. The language was unequivocal. Paul Henson was cited for racial discrimination, excessive force, and falsification by omission. Lucas Grant was cited for failure to intervene and aiding an unlawful detention. By early afternoon, the outcome was no longer theoretical. Careers were ending. At 1:58 p.m., Paul Henson was formally terminated. No press release, no announcement, just a signature and an escort. Grant was dismissed later that day, pending final certification review. Inside headquarters, the mood was tense and quiet. Supervisors avoided eye contact. Investigators continued pulling files, aware that attention would soon turn upward. Lieutenant Pike understood what the investigators had uncovered was bigger than two officers. It wasn't an anomaly, it was tolerance, and tolerance, once documented, carried consequences. By the third day, the case was no longer moving along a single track. It had split into parallel processes, and all of them were accelerating. At 7:18 a.m., federal subpoenas were issued. They went to the Port Calder Transit Authority, to the city attorney's office, to Transit Police Headquarters. The requests were comprehensive: internal emails, training records, use of force reviews, supervisor notes, complaint handling procedures. The scope was no longer limited to what happened. It now focused on why nothing stopped it. Inside a federal office hundreds of miles away, DOJ attorneys reviewed synchronized footage on a large screen. One clip was paused repeatedly. Henson's voice, dismissive and calm, saying something doesn't add up here, followed seconds later by physical contact. A senior prosecutor broke the silence. "That's pretext," she said. "Not assessment." Back in Port Calder, Lieutenant Aaron Pike was called into another closed-door session, this time with federal investigators present. He was asked directly about prior complaints against Henson. Why were they dismissed? Why was no remedial training mandated? Why were warning signs documented but not acted upon? Pike answered without defensiveness. Supervisors had logged concerns. Internal Affairs had found complaints inconclusive. No single incident had crossed the threshold for discipline. The investigators exchanged glances. That explanation carried weight and not in Pike's favor. At 10:39 a.m., the Department of Justice formally notified the city of its intent to file a federal civil rights action unless a negotiated resolution was reached. The notice outlined likely findings: unlawful detention, excessive force, racial discrimination, failure of institutional oversight. City attorneys understood immediately. This was not a case to litigate aggressively. It was a case to contain. Meanwhile, Malcolm Reed had returned to his office following a mandatory medical evaluation. Bruising had spread across his upper back and shoulder. The examining physician documented soft tissue trauma consistent with a knee-driven restraint. Reed's supervisor had already reviewed the footage. "You handled this exactly right," he told Reed. "It didn't escalate because of you, it escalated because it was captured." Reed was asked whether he intended to pursue civil action. "Yes," he replied, "for record, not revenge." That distinction mattered. By 1:26 p.m., city officials entered negotiations with federal attorneys. The terms were not optional. Independent monitoring of transit police operations, mandatory bias and de-escalation training, revised detention and stop protocols, external review of all transit police use of force incidents for a fixed period, and accountability. At 2:43 p.m., updated termination notices were issued, this time attached to federal findings. Henson's decertification was expedited. Grant's certification was suspended indefinitely. Neither officer appealed. They couldn't. The evidence was complete. As negotiations continued, internal consequences spread outward. Two supervisors who had previously dismissed complaints involving Henson were placed under review. One requested early retirement. Another was reassigned pending outcome. By the end of the day, transit police leadership was operating under interim authority. The collision everyone had tried to avoid was now unavoidable. Federal oversight had met local discretion, and local discretion had failed. Only one question remained unanswered: how publicly would that failure be recorded? The resolution did not arrive with sirens or headlines. It arrived as paperwork. 26 days after the incident at Union Bay Transit Hub, the Department of Justice finalized its findings. The conclusion was direct and unambiguous. Malcolm Reed had been unlawfully detained, subjected to excessive force, and targeted based on racial bias while fully compliant. There were no qualifiers, no alternate interpretations. The evidence was complete. Body camera footage showed escalation without cause. Fixed surveillance confirmed physical contact preceded resistance. Civilian recordings corroborated Reed's statements. Internal emails documented prior warnings that went unaddressed. Taken together, they formed a single causal chain. Officer Paul Henson was formally decertified by the State Law Enforcement Board. His termination for gross misconduct, civil rights violations, and falsification by omission was made permanent. He was barred from holding any law enforcement position within the state. His name was entered into a national decertification registry used by agencies to screen applicants. No department challenged it. Officer Lucas Grant lost his certification weeks later. Investigators concluded his failure to intervene was not confusion or hesitation, but conscious deference to authority despite recognizing the absence of threat. His career ended without ceremony, credentials revoked, record closed. The consequences did not stop with them. Two supervisors were disciplined for prior inaction. One accepted early retirement while under review. Another was demoted and removed from operational command. The Port Calder Transit Police Department entered into a federal consent agreement requiring independent external oversight, mandatory bias and de-escalation training, revised stop and detention standards, federal review of all use of force incidents for a minimum of 5 years. The department did not contest the terms. Civil court followed. Malcolm Reed filed a federal civil rights lawsuit citing unlawful detention, excessive force, racial discrimination, and institutional failure. The city settled before discovery concluded. The settlement amount was significant, but it was not the story. The record was. For the city, it meant federal monitoring and a public acknowledgement of systemic failure. For the department, it meant admitting that warning signs had been seen and ignored. For Henson and Grant, it meant consequences tied not to optics but to decisions. Reed was formally briefed by his leadership once the case closed. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do," he was told. "You let the evidence speak." Reed's response was brief: "That's all I wanted." Weeks later, Reed traveled again through Union Bay Transit Hub. Same route, same posture, same quiet professionalism. No one stopped him. No one questioned whether he belonged. Inside Transit Police Headquarters, a training bulletin was circulated internally. It included a still image taken from body camera footage. A man face down on the terminal floor, officers above him. The caption read, "This is what failure looks like." No names were included, they weren't needed. If this case held your attention, don't watch in silence. Like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to see how power, bias, and accountability collide, not in theory, but in reality. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from?